Captain James Peterson had always been the kind of man who followed rules. For 15 years he'd served in the Royal Guard with pride, standing watch over important meetings, protecting dignitaries, and keeping secrets that weren't his to tell. His uniform was always pressed perfectly, his shoes polished until they gleamed, and his record spotless, not a single complaint, not one mistake. People trusted him. But on this cold Wednesday morning in London, James found himself sitting in a small, windowless room deep inside Westminster Palace, and his hands wouldn't stop shaking. In front of him sat 3 serious-looking people from Parliament, all watching him carefully. And on the table between them was a worn brown leather folder that felt like it weighed 1,000 pounds. Inside that folder were things James wished he'd never seen. Photographs taken with a hidden phone camera, printed emails that someone thought they'd deleted, handwritten notes on hotel stationery, encrypted messages that he'd somehow managed to decode with help from a tech-savvy friend who didn't ask too many questions. All of it pointed to something that shouldn't exist, something that would shake the government if it ever got out. 6 months ago, James had been doing his regular job at a fancy diplomatic party. The kind where everyone wore expensive suits and pretended to like champagne they couldn't even pronounce. His role was simple: stand near the door, watch the room, make sure nothing went wrong. It was boring work mostly, but it paid well and came with a pension. That night he'd been positioned near a side corridor when he noticed something odd. A group of men slipping away from the main party, moving quickly toward a private room that wasn't on the official schedule. Among them, he recognized some faces from the news and some he'd been briefed about in security meetings. They looked nervous, constantly checking over their shoulders. James had followed at a distance. It was his job to know where everyone was, after all. What he overheard through the partially open door made his blood run cold. They were discussing arrangements that contradicted everything being said in public. Trade deals that would benefit certain people while others got nothing. Money moving through channels that definitely weren't official. And at the center of it all was a former American president, whose name everyone in the world knew. At first, James tried to convince himself he'd misunderstood. Maybe it was all legitimate, just complicated politics that a simple guard wouldn't understand. He told himself to forget it, to focus on his job and not ask questions. But then he started noticing patterns. The same people meeting again and again, documents left carelessly on tables after meetings, conversations that stopped abruptly when he entered a room. So he started collecting evidence. Not because he wanted to be a hero or get attention, but because something deep inside him said this was wrong. Every piece of evidence felt like another brick in his stomach. He couldn't sleep properly anymore. His wife noticed he'd become distant, distracted. His kids asked why Daddy seemed so worried all the time, but he couldn't tell them. Couldn't tell anyone. James had tried doing things the right way first. He'd mentioned his concerns to his immediate supervisor, who'd looked uncomfortable and told him to mind his own business. He'd written a formal report to the Internal Affairs Department, which disappeared into some filing system and was never acknowledged. He'd even called a government ethics hotline, only to be told his claims were too vague and lacked evidence. That's when he realized nobody wanted to hear what he had to say through proper channels. The system was designed to protect itself, not to expose its own flaws. So James made the hardest decision of his life. He contacted Parliament directly, through a member he'd once provided security for, someone with a reputation for honesty. Now here he sat, watching these 3 officials flip through his folder with expressions that shifted from skepticism to shock to something like fear. The room smelled like old books and furniture polish. A clock on the wall ticked so loudly it felt like it was inside his head. Outside this room, London was going about its normal Wednesday business. People were riding the tube, buying coffee, complaining about the weather. They had no idea what was about to hit them. The lead investigator, a stern woman named Dame Patricia Holbrook, finally looked up at him. Her face had gone pale. She closed the folder carefully as if it might explode and locked eyes with James. "Captain Peterson," she said quietly, "do you understand what you've brought us here today? Do you understand that if even half of this is true, it will cause a crisis unlike anything we've seen in decades?" James nodded slowly. His throat felt dry. "Yes, ma'am. I understand. And you're absolutely certain about what you saw and heard? There's no doubt in your mind?" "No doubt at all," James replied, his voice steadier than he felt. "I wish there was, honestly. I wish I could say I got it all wrong. But I didn't. What's in that folder is real and people need to know about it. Another official, an older man with silver hair, leaned forward. You realize this will destroy your career, don't you? Regardless of whether you're right or wrong, there will be people who see you as a traitor. You'll need protection. Your family will need protection. Your life is about to become very, very complicated. James had thought about this every day for 6 months. He'd imagined losing his job, his friends, maybe even his freedom if powerful people decided to come after him. He'd imagined his kids being bullied at school, his wife losing her teaching position because of the association. He'd imagined all of it, and it terrified him, but every time he thought about staying silent, about burying what he knew, he felt even worse. I know, he said simply, but if I don't do this, I won't be able to look at myself in the mirror anymore. I took an oath when I joined the Guard, to serve with honor, to protect the truth, to put country before personal interest. This is me keeping that oath, even if it cost me everything. Dame Patricia nodded slowly, respect flickering across her stern features. She glanced at her colleagues, then back at James. All right then. We're going to need to record your full testimony, every detail from the beginning. This is going to take days, possibly weeks. Are you prepared for that? Yes, ma'am. Then let's begin. But first I need you to understand something, Captain Peterson. Once we start this process, there's no going back. The moment your testimony is recorded, the clock starts ticking. And when this story gets out, and it will get out, they always do, your life and the lives of everyone involved will never be the same. Last chance to walk away. James thought about his father, who'd also served in the military and had always taught him that honor wasn't about doing the easy thing. It was about doing the right thing even when it hurt. He thought about his daughter, who was learning in school about democracy and government and how systems were supposed to work. He thought about all the ordinary people who trusted their leaders to be honest with them. I'm ready, James said. Let's do this. As the recording equipment was set up and microphones were positioned, James felt something shift inside him. The fear was still there, but underneath it was something else. Relief, maybe, or purpose. For 6 months he'd carried this weight alone, and now finally he was sharing it. Whatever happened next, at least he'd done the right thing. The red light on the camera blinked on, and James Peterson began to tell his story. For 3 long days, the parliamentary committee barely left that secure room. They ordered food delivered, drank coffee by the pot, and worked through the night examining every single piece of evidence James Peterson had brought them. The folder that had seemed so damning at first glance turned out to be just the beginning. Dame Patricia Holbrook, who'd been in politics for 30 years and thought she'd seen everything, found herself constantly surprised. She'd pull out a photograph, study it for a minute, then pass it to her colleagues with a grim expression. Some pictures showed important British officials meeting with American businessmen in locations that weren't in any official schedule. Other photos captured documents on tables, zoomed in enough to read specific phrases that made everyone in the room uncomfortable. The text messages were perhaps the most shocking part. Someone had been careless, thinking that encrypted apps meant total privacy. But encryption only works if you trust everyone who has the keys. And apparently someone in the chain hadn't been trustworthy. The committee read through conversations that talked about private understandings and arrangements that benefit everyone. There were references to offshore accounts, to shell companies with names that meant nothing, to payments disguised as consulting fees. One message in particular kept coming up in their discussions. It was from a British official to an American contact, sent late at night during what should have been a formal state visit. The message read, "He agrees to our terms. Nothing in writing, nothing official. The usual channels stay clean. Our mutual friends will handle the details." Who was he? The committee had their suspicions, but suspicions weren't proof. They needed more. They brought in experts, financial analysts who specialized in tracking money through complex systems. These specialists spent hours going through bank records, corporate filings, and transaction histories. What they found made the picture clearer and more troubling. Money had moved between countries in patterns that didn't match any legitimate business activity. Timing was too perfect, amounts too specific. It looked exactly like what you'd see if people were paying each other for favors, but trying to hide it. One financial expert, a quiet woman named Dr. Chen, who usually worked for the Fraud Investigation Service, pointed out something particularly damning. A shell company registered in the Cayman Islands had received 3 large payments from British sources. then made payments to American companies owned by people close to the former president. The dates matched perfectly with key moments in trade negotiations. "This isn't random," Dr. Chen explained, pointing at her computer screen. "Money doesn't move like this by accident. Someone set up this system deliberately, creating layers to make it hard to trace. But they made mistakes. They got sloppy, probably because they didn't think anyone would ever look this closely." The committee also examined the handwritten notes James had photographed. These were harder to interpret because the handwriting was sometimes messy, and the context wasn't always clear, but certain phrases kept appearing. Keep it quiet, outside normal process, mutually beneficial arrangement, and disturbingly, nobody needs to know. What made everything more explosive was the names involved. These weren't junior staffers or random businessmen. The evidence pointed to high-ranking officials, people who appeared on television defending government policy, people who'd sworn oaths to serve the public interest. Some of these individuals had specifically been asked in Parliament about secret deals or unofficial arrangements, and they denied everything under oath. Dame Patricia remembered one particular parliamentary session where opposition members had questioned the trade minister about rumors of backdoor agreements with American interests. The minister had stood at the dispatch box, looked directly at the camera, and said clearly, "There are no secret deals. All our negotiations follow proper procedures and are fully documented." These conspiracy theories are insulting to everyone involved in legitimate diplomatic work. Now, looking at the evidence spread across the table, Dame Patricia realized that statement had been a lie. A deliberate, calculated lie told to Parliament and the public. That made it not just unethical but potentially criminal. Lying to Parliament was serious business, the kind of thing that ended careers and sometimes led to prison sentences. By the end of day 2, the mood in the room had shifted from skeptical investigation to grim certainty. They had something real here, something that couldn't be explained away or dismissed as misunderstanding. The question now wasn't whether something improper had happened, but how deep it went and who all was involved. The committee also had to consider international implications. If this evidence became public, it would damage relationships with America at a time when Britain needed strong allies. It would raise questions about every trade deal negotiated in recent years. Other countries would wonder if they'd been cheated or misled. Financial markets would react badly to the uncertainty. On the third day, they brought in a cybersecurity expert to verify the digital evidence. They needed to be absolutely certain that the emails and messages were genuine, not fabricated or altered. The expert, a young man who looked too tired to be dealing with something this important, spent hours examining metadata, checking timestamps, and verifying encryption signatures. Finally, he looked up from his laptop and nodded. "It's all genuine." No signs of tampering or alteration. These communications are real, sent when the timestamps say they were sent, from the devices they appear to come from. Someone might argue about interpretation or context, but they can't argue that these are fake. That confirmation changed everything. Dame Patricia felt the weight of responsibility settle on her shoulders like a physical burden. They now had solid evidence of serious wrongdoing by senior officials. They had proof that Parliament and the public had been lied to. They had documentation of arrangements that looked very much like corruption, even if lawyers might argue about the technical definition. But they also had a massive problem. This information was classified at the highest level. Releasing it publicly could cause a constitutional crisis. Not releasing it would mean participating in a cover-up. Either choice had terrible consequences. Dame Patricia called for a break and stepped outside the secure room for the first time in days. The normal hallway of Westminster Palace felt surreal after being locked in that small room with such explosive information. Staff members walked past carrying papers, having normal conversations about normal political business. They had no idea what was about to hit them. She pulled out her phone and made a secure call to the Speaker of the House of Commons. The conversation was brief and cryptic, but she could hear the tension in his voice when she said they needed to convene an emergency session soon. Very soon. Back in the secure room, the committee made their decision. They would classify the evidence under the highest security protocols, but they would also prepare a summary for key parliamentary leaders. An emergency closed-door session would be scheduled within the week. There they would present their findings to party leaders and let them decide the next steps. What they didn't account for was human nature. In a building full of ambitious politicians, competitive journalists, and staff members with varying levels of loyalty, keeping something this big secret was nearly impossible. It was like trying to hold water in your hands. Eventually, something was going to slip through. Dame Patricia looked at the folder, now much thicker with their analysis and expert reports, and felt a sense of dread. James Peterson had brought them a grenade with the pin pulled. Now they were all just waiting to see how big the explosion would be. She closed the folder carefully and locked it in a safe that required 3 different keys, held by 3 different people. As she left the secure room for the last time that day, she knew that within a few days, maybe hours, this secret would be out. And when it was, nothing in British politics would ever be quite the same again. The clock was ticking and there was no way to stop it. Despite every security measure, despite locked safes and confidentiality agreements and threats of prosecution, the secret lasted exactly 4 days before it started leaking out. The way it happened was almost predictable, really. In Westminster, secrets were currency, and someone always found a way to spend them. Tommy Richardson was 26 years old and worked as a junior aide to one of the committee members. He was the kind of young idealist who'd come to Westminster believing in transparency and accountability, only to spend most of his time filing papers and fetching coffee. But Tommy also had access to offices he shouldn't have been in, and he'd learned how to be invisible, the way junior staff always do. He'd overheard a phone conversation. Then he'd seen part of a document left on a printer. Then he'd connected dots that maybe he shouldn't have been able to connect. And suddenly Tommy knew something huge was happening. Something about the Royal Guard and secret deals and lies told to Parliament. At first, Tommy told himself he'd keep quiet. He needed this job. His student loans weren't going to pay themselves and jobs in Westminster were hard to get. But then he lay awake at night thinking about it. If officials had lied to the public about secret deals, didn't people have a right to know? Wasn't transparency the whole point of democracy? He thought about all the speeches he'd heard about accountability and public service. He thought about why he'd wanted to work in government in the first place. And he made a decision that would change everything. Tommy knew a journalist named Lisa Zhang who worked for The Guardian. They'd met at a Westminster mixer months ago, stayed in touch on social media. She was tough, smart, and had a reputation for careful reporting. He sent her an encrypted message. Need to talk. Have information about something big. Not safe to discuss details yet. They met in a cafe far from Westminster, in a neighborhood where politicians never went. Tommy was so nervous he could barely hold his coffee cup steady. But he told Lisa what he knew, speaking quietly, constantly checking over his shoulder. Lisa listened carefully, asking sharp questions, making notes in a code only she understood. She'd been a journalist for 15 years and had learned to spot liars and attention seekers. But Tommy seemed genuine, frightened even. And the details he provided matched rumors she'd been hearing from her own sources. I need to verify this independently, Lisa told him. I can't run a story based on one anonymous source, especially something this serious. But if you're telling the truth, this is massive. Over the next 48 hours, Lisa worked harder than she'd ever worked in her life. She called in favors from sources across Westminster. She tracked down former officials who might know something. She cross-referenced Tommy's information with documents she'd obtained through Freedom of Information requests months ago for unrelated stories. Slowly, piece by piece, she confirmed enough details to know the story was real. Lisa's editor was skeptical at first. Claims about secret deals involving powerful people were easy to make and hard to prove. But as Lisa showed him her notes, her source verification, her documented trail of evidence, he realized they had something genuine. We need to be incredibly careful with this, the editor said, pacing his office. If we get even one detail wrong, they'll use it to discredit everything. Our lawyers need to check every single word. The legal team spent hours going through the article, removing anything that could be considered libel, making sure every claim was defensible. The final headline read, Royal Guard claims secret deal between British officials and Trump administration, Parliament investigating. The article was carefully worded. It said a Royal Guard member had provided evidence to Parliament about alleged unauthorized arrangements. It noted that an investigation was underway. It quoted anonymous sources confirming that committee members were treating the matter as serious. It didn't make direct accusations, but the implications were crystal clear. The Guardian published the story online at 6 in the morning, timing it to hit just as London was waking up. Within 15 minutes, it was trending on social media. Within an hour, every major news outlet in Britain was scrambling to follow up. By lunchtime, it had gone global. The response was immediate and explosive. On Twitter, hashtags like Drowning Secret Deal and on Trumpgate started trending worldwide. People shared the article millions of times. Some declared it proof of everything they'd suspected about corrupt politicians. Others called it fake news and conspiracy theory. Nobody could agree on what it meant, but everybody had an opinion. Television news channels interrupted regular programming for special reports. Pundits who'd never heard of the story an hour ago were suddenly experts, debating its significance with absolute confidence. News anchors practiced saying alleged secret arrangement in serious voices while graphics flashed behind them. The British Foreign Office released a statement so carefully worded it basically said nothing. We are aware of media reports regarding ongoing parliamentary investigations. It would be inappropriate to comment on active investigations. The UK maintains strong diplomatic relationships with all partners and follows proper procedures in all international dealings. That non-denial denial just made people more suspicious. If it was all false, why not just say so clearly? Across the Atlantic, Trump's spokesperson released a statement that was much less diplomatic. These reports are completely false and represent another desperate attempt by the fake news media and their allies in the UK to damage President Trump. There were no secret deals, no improper arrangements, and no wrongdoing of any kind. This is pure fiction designed to distract from real issues. But that statement had its own problems. Nobody had specifically mentioned Trump by name in the original article, at least not prominently. By responding so forcefully, his team had made the connection explicit, getting his name attached to the scandal more firmly than the original story had. Financial markets didn't like uncertainty. By the end of trading in London, the pound had dropped against major currencies. Stock prices for companies involved in transatlantic trade wobbled nervously. Investors started pulling back from British government bonds, worried about political instability. Back at Westminster, officials went into crisis mode. Phones rang nonstop. Meetings were called and called again. Members of Parliament who'd been enjoying a relatively quiet week suddenly found themselves at the center of a political firestorm. Opposition leaders smelled blood in the water. The shadow foreign secretary called an impromptu press conference on the steps of Parliament, cameras crowding around him. If these reports are accurate, we are looking at potentially the most serious breach of public trust in a generation, he declared, his voice ringing with practiced outrage. The British people deserve immediate answers. Who authorized these alleged arrangements? What was offered and what was received in return? Why was Parliament kept in the dark? We demand a full public inquiry, and we demand it now. The governing party's response was more defensive. The chief whip sent urgent messages to all members of Parliament. Say nothing to the press, refer all questions to the party leadership, do not speculate or comment on ongoing investigations. Several MPs ignored these instructions, giving interviews that contradicted each other and made the situation worse. And at the center of this growing storm was Captain James Peterson, the man who'd started it all. Within hours of the article's publication, reporters had identified him and staked out his home. His phone rang constantly with interview requests and threats. His wife had to take their kids out of school early because journalists were showing up at the gates. The Royal Guard moved quickly to provide him with security protection, not because they supported what he'd done, but because they had a duty to protect their personnel. James found himself essentially under house arrest for his own safety, watching the chaos unfold on television and wondering if he'd done the right thing. That night, protests started forming outside Parliament. Some people carried signs demanding transparency and accountability. Others waved flags and chanted about protecting British sovereignty. A smaller group called for James to be arrested for betraying state secrets. The Metropolitan Police had to bring in extra officers to keep different groups separated and prevent violence. Inside Westminster, in private offices and secure phone calls, powerful people were having very different conversations than their public statements suggested. Some were genuinely shocked by the allegations. Others were frantically trying to remember what they'd said, written or known about the arrangements. And a few were already planning their defense strategies, consulting lawyers, and considering whether to cooperate or deny everything. Dame Patricia Holbrook watched the news coverage from her office, feeling sick to her stomach. She'd known the story would leak eventually, but she'd hoped for more time to prepare, to brief party leaders properly, to manage the rollout of information in a controlled way. Instead, it had exploded messily into public view, and now everyone was scrambling to catch up. Her phone buzzed with a text from the Speaker of the House. Emergency parliamentary session. Tomorrow morning. Be ready. Patricia sighed and looked at her schedule. She was supposed to have dinner with her grandchildren tonight, a rare evening off. She texted her daughter that she'd have to cancel again. The House of Commons chamber had seen heated debates before, but nothing quite like this. By 8 in the morning, hours before the emergency session was scheduled to begin, journalists and photographers crowded the press gallery, fighting for the best positions. Members of Parliament arrived early, wanting to secure their usual seats and get a feel for the room's mood before things started. The public galleries filled up quickly with citizens who'd queued for hours in the cold morning air. Desperate to witness history, security was tighter than anyone could remember, with multiple checkpoints and bag searches. The Metropolitan Police had officers stationed throughout the building, not sure what to expect but ready for anything. Inside the chamber itself, the atmosphere felt electric. MPs from all parties clustered in small groups, having whispered conversations that stopped abruptly whenever someone from the other side walked past. Some checked their phones constantly, reading the latest updates and social media reactions. Others sat quietly, preparing their speeches or just trying to steady their nerves. Prime Minister Jonathan Sheffield looked like he'd aged 10 years overnight. Dark circles under his eyes suggested he hadn't slept much. His normally perfect suit seemed slightly rumpled and his tie wasn't quite straight. He sat on the government's front bench surrounded by senior ministers who looked equally stressed. Across the aisle, Opposition Leader Catherine Mills sat with her shadow cabinet, and they looked ready for a fight. Catherine was known for her sharp questioning and her ability to spot weakness in an opponent's argument. Today, she'd brought a thick folder of documents and had sticky notes marking specific pages. Her team had clearly spent all night preparing. At precisely 9 o'clock, the Speaker of the House entered and everyone stood. The traditional ceremony felt strange given the chaos surrounding them, but Parliament ran on tradition, even in crisis. The Speaker called the House to order, and the noise level dropped to an expectant hum. "The House will come to order," the Speaker said, his voice firm but showing strain. "We convene today for an emergency session regarding serious allegations that have been raised concerning government conduct. I expect all members to maintain parliamentary decorum regardless of their feelings on this matter. The Prime Minister will make an opening statement." Jonathan Sheffield rose slowly, gripping his notes perhaps a bit too tightly. Every camera in the chamber focused on him. In offices and homes across Britain, millions of people stopped what they were doing to watch. "Mr. Speaker, members of the House," the Prime Minister began, his voice steady despite his exhausted appearance. "We meet today to address reports and allegations that have dominated our national conversation for the past 24 hours. I want to begin by stating clearly that this government takes these matters with the utmost seriousness." He paused, looking around the chamber. "An investigation is currently underway, conducted by a parliamentary committee with full access to relevant materials. It would be inappropriate and potentially harmful to that investigation for me to comment on specific details at this time. However, I can assure this House and the British people that we are committed to transparency and accountability." Before he could continue, shouts erupted from the opposition benches. "Transparency? That's rich," someone yelled. "What about the lies told to this very chamber?" Another voice called out. The Speaker banged his gavel repeatedly. "Order, order! The Prime Minister has the floor." Sheffield continued, raising his voice slightly. "I understand the opposition's eagerness to make political points from this situation, but I would caution all members against rushing to judgment before all facts are known. Speculation and accusation without evidence serve no one and could seriously damage our international relationships and national security." That was apparently too much for Catherine Mills. She stood up, not waiting to be properly called upon. "Point of order, Mr. Speaker." The Speaker looked irritated but nodded. "The Leader of the Opposition." Catherine stepped forward, her voice clear and sharp. The Prime Minister speaks of not rushing to judgment. But I have here documented evidence. She held up papers from her folder that suggests certain members of this government were asked directly about secret arrangements with foreign powers and denied their existence under oath. This isn't speculation. These are documented parliamentary questions and recorded answers. The chamber erupted. The speaker's gavel banged repeatedly, but the noise level kept rising. MPs on both sides were shouting now, some defending their party, others demanding answers. In the public gallery, people craned forward, not wanting to miss a single word. Finally, order was restored enough for Catherine to continue. Mr. Speaker, the people of Britain are watching this chamber today, wondering if they can trust their government. They're wondering if the democratic institutions they believe in are functioning as they should, or if there's a parallel system operating in secret, making deals that benefit a few powerful individuals at the expense of everyone else. She turned to face the Prime Minister directly. So I asked the right honorable gentleman, did members of this government engage in unauthorized diplomatic arrangements? Were MPs misled when they asked about such arrangements? And if the answer to either of these questions is yes, why should this government remain in power? The Prime Minister stood again, his face flushed. The leader of the opposition is making serious accusations without full knowledge of the facts. The investigation is ongoing. I cannot and will not comment on matters that could compromise national security or international relations based on incomplete information and media speculation. That answer satisfied no one. Opposition MPs shouted that it wasn't good enough. Even some government backbenchers looked uncomfortable, shifting in their seats and avoiding eye contact with their leadership. An independent MP, David O'Brien, rose and was recognized by the Speaker. O'Brien was respected across party lines for his integrity and thoughtful approach. When he spoke, even the loudest members of the chamber quieted down to listen. Mr. Speaker, I rise not as a member of any party, but as a representative of constituents who are confused and concerned, O'Brien began, his Irish accent becoming more pronounced as emotion crept into his voice. For months, years even, we have debated in this chamber about trust in government, about the importance of institutions, about maintaining public confidence in our democratic processes. He looked around the chamber, making eye contact with members on all sides. And now we face a moment that tests all of that. A member of the Royal Guard, a man with 15 years of honorable service, has apparently felt compelled to bring forward evidence of serious wrongdoing. He didn't sell his story to the tabloids. He didn't go on television. He followed proper procedures, bringing his concerns to a parliamentary committee. O'Brien's voice grew stronger. That same committee has spent days examining his evidence and has apparently found it credible enough to warrant this emergency session. So I ask all of us on both sides of this chamber, what does it say about our institutions if we treat this moment as just another opportunity for political point scoring? What message does that send to ordinary citizens who believe, perhaps naively, that their representatives care more about truth than about party advantage? The chamber was silent now, everyone listening. Even the Prime Minister and Catherine Mills seemed momentarily caught by O'Brien's words. The question before us today is not about politics, O'Brien continued. It's about whether we have the courage to look honestly at ourselves and our system. If wrongdoing occurred, we must address it regardless of which party is implicated. If mistakes were made, we must acknowledge them and fix the processes that allowed them to happen. And if officials lied to this Parliament, then those officials must face consequences, because nothing is more fundamental to democracy than the assumption that our representatives are telling us the truth. He sat down to murmurs of approval from across the chamber. For a moment, it seemed like O'Brien might have shifted the mood toward something more constructive. But then a government minister stood up with a prepared statement defending the administration's diplomatic practices. And the partisan arguing started again. MPs interrupted each other, talked over each other, waved papers and pointed fingers. The speaker's gavel kept banging, creating a rhythm that punctuated the chaos. Hours passed. Some MPs gave impassioned speeches about accountability. Others defended the government's right to conduct sensitive diplomacy. Some called for immediate resignations. Others warned about the dangers of mob justice based on unverified reports. Every argument had a counter-argument, every point a rebuttal. In the press gallery, journalists typed furiously, sending updates and analysis every few minutes. On social media, clips from the debate went viral, often stripped of context, used to support whatever narrative the person sharing them preferred. By mid-afternoon, some things had become clear. First, nobody was going to resign voluntarily. Second, the investigation would continue, with promises of updates to Parliament. Third, and perhaps most importantly, the political damage was already done. The public had watched hours of their elected representatives arguing, deflecting and avoiding direct answers. Trust, already fragile, had taken another hit. The scandal didn't stay contained within Britain's borders for long. Like ripples spreading across a pond, the story reached out to touch governments, businesses, and ordinary people across the globe. What had started as one man's decision to speak truth had turned into an international incident that nobody quite knew how to handle. In Washington, D.C., the State Department went into what staff privately called damage control mode. Press. Briefings that usually covered routine diplomatic matters suddenly became tense affairs, where every question circled back to the alleged secret deal. The official spokesman, a career diplomat named Robert Chen, found himself repeating carefully crafted non-answers that satisfied nobody. The United States maintains strong and transparent relationships with all our allies, Robert would say, his expression carefully neutral. We conduct diplomacy through proper channels and in accordance with all applicable laws and regulations. We cannot comment on alleged arrangements that we have no knowledge of. But behind those official statements, things were much more chaotic. Career diplomats who'd spent years building relationships with their British counterparts suddenly found themselves frozen out of meetings or receiving awkwardly formal emails where warm friendships used to exist. Nobody wanted to be caught appearing too close to the controversy. The American intelligence agencies launched their own quiet investigation. They needed to know what had actually happened, not for public consumption but for their own operational security. If there really had been secret channels operating without proper oversight, that was a huge problem regardless of who was president at the time. In Brussels, European Union officials watched the British scandal with a mixture of concern and, some admitted privately, a bit of satisfaction. Britain had left the EU years ago, and the divorce hadn't been friendly. Now questions were being raised about whether Brexit negotiations themselves had been compromised by these alleged secret arrangements. If the British government was making side deals with Americans, while publicly negotiating with us, that changes everything about how we should interpret those talks, said one EU trade official during a private meeting. The comment leaked, as comments from private meetings always do, and added another layer of complexity to an already messy situation. Trade partners across the world started questioning their own agreements with Britain. If secret deals were possible with one country, what about others? Japanese officials quietly requested clarifications on several trade provisions. Canadian diplomats asked for additional documentation on agreements they'd previously accepted without question. Even small nations that rarely pushed back on anything suddenly found their voices demanding transparency. The financial markets hated uncertainty, and this situation was nothing but uncertainty. The British pound continued its slide against other major currencies. Stock prices for British companies involved in international trade fluctuated wildly based on whatever the latest rumor was. Investment funds that specialized in British government bonds started moving money elsewhere, worried about political instability, but perhaps the biggest international reaction came from Donald Trump himself. The former president had never been shy about expressing his opinions, and this situation was no exception. He held a press conference at his resort in Florida, surrounded by supporters and staff, looking as defiant as ever. This is another witch hunt. Another fake story created by people who can't accept that I made great deals for America, Trump declared, his voice rising as he warmed to his subject. The British establishment is corrupt. They're jealous of American success, and now they're trying to blame me for their own failures. I had great relationships with British leaders. I made great deals that benefited both countries, and there was nothing secret about it. Everything was legal. Everything was proper. And the fake news media knows it. Reporters shouted questions, but Trump just kept talking, segueing into complaints about other investigations he'd faced, about political opponents, about media bias. His supporters in the crowd cheered. His critics watching on television shook their heads. And in the middle, millions of ordinary people tried to figure out what to believe. Trump's statement predictably made everything worse. By responding so forcefully to allegations that hadn't even specifically named him in the original reporting, he'd made himself central to the story. News coverage that might have focused on British officials now split time between London and Trump's resort, creating a transatlantic scandal that fed on itself. His former staff members started getting calls from investigators and journalists. Some cooperated, some refused, and some hired lawyers before saying anything. The former Secretary of State issued a statement saying he'd followed all proper procedures and had no knowledge of any inappropriate arrangements. Two former aides gave anonymous interviews suggesting that Trump had indeed preferred working through unofficial channels, though they provided no specific evidence of wrongdoing. In countries that had complicated relationships with both America and Britain, the scandal created awkward diplomatic situations. Should they express support for their allies? Remain neutral? Use this as an opportunity to push for better terms in their own negotiations? Different countries made different choices, but all of them were watching carefully to see how the situation developed. China's state media ran stories suggesting this proved Western democracy was corrupt and hypocritical. Russia's government-controlled news outlets did the same, using the scandal as evidence that American and British criticism of their own system was baseless. Neither country mentioned that their own diplomatic processes were far less transparent, but that wasn't the point. The point was to score propaganda victories while the West was distracted and divided. Meanwhile, protest had spread beyond Britain. In major cities across Europe and North America, demonstrations formed outside British embassies and consulates. Some protesters demanded accountability from their own governments, questioning whether similar secret arrangements existed in their countries. Others were simply angry at what they saw as betrayal by leaders who were supposed to serve public interest. The scandal also created strange political alliances. Left-wing activists who usually focused on economic inequality found themselves aligned with right-wing nationalists who opposed international cooperation. Both groups saw the alleged secret deal as evidence that elites operated by different rules than ordinary people. Traditional political categories seemed less relevant when the issue was basic honesty and transparency. For ordinary British citizens living abroad, the scandal made life uncomfortable in ways they hadn't anticipated. Conversations with foreign friends and colleagues now inevitably turned to politics and corruption. Some felt defensive, wanting to explain that not all British officials were corrupt. Others felt embarrassed, apologizing for their government even though they'd had no part in whatever had or hadn't happened. British expatriates working in international companies found their credibility questioned. Were they aware of secret arrangements in their own business dealings? Could they be trusted to follow proper procedures? These questions were rarely asked directly, but they hung in the air, making professional relationships awkward. Tourism to Britain took a hit as well. Some people canceled trips, not wanting to spend money in a country whose government was under such serious scrutiny. Hotels and airlines reported increased cancellations. Tour operators worried about the summer season. The economic impact was hard to quantify exactly, but everyone in the tourism industry could feel it. International students reconsidered whether to attend British universities. If the government couldn't be trusted to be honest, what did that say about the education system, about research integrity, about degree recognition in other countries? University administrators scrambled to reassure worried parents and students that academic standards remained high, regardless of political scandals. And throughout all of this international chaos, the original question remained unanswered. Had there actually been a secret deal? And if so, what exactly had been agreed to? Different countries, different media outlets, different political factions all had their own theories, but solid facts remained elusive. Intelligence agencies around the world stepped up their monitoring of British and American diplomatic communications, not trusting official statements anymore. Allies who'd previously shared information freely now held back, worried about where that information might end up. The invisible networks of trust and cooperation that made international relations function smoothly had taken serious damage. In a globalized world where everything connected to everything else, a scandal in one country couldn't stay isolated. Britain's political crisis had become everyone's problem, affecting trade, diplomacy, finance, and ordinary people's lives in ways both obvious and subtle. The ripples kept spreading, and nobody knew where they would finally stop or what the world would look like when everything finally settled. The international community waited, watched and worried about what would come next. As investigators dug deeper into the scandal, they started uncovering names that hadn't been in the original reports. What had seemed like a straightforward story about secret deals between governments began revealing itself as something far more complicated, a web of relationships and interests that nobody had fully understood at first. Sir Edmund Hartley was the first major name to surface after the initial reports. He'd recently retired from his position as a special trade envoy, taking what he'd called a well-earned rest after decades of public service. Edmund had the kind of resume that impressed people: prestigious university education, successful business career before entering government service, knighthood for his contributions to international trade. But journalists digging through public records found something interesting. Edmund had attended at least 7 meetings during the time period in question that weren't in any official logs. These meetings took place in private clubs, luxury hotels, even once on a yacht anchored off the coast of Monaco. The meetings included various British officials, American businessmen, and at least one person with direct access to Trump's inner circle. Even more interesting were Edmund's financial records. After a Freedom of Information request and some clever research by investigative journalists, a pattern emerged. Edmund had received payments from 3 different consulting firms within weeks of key moments in trade negotiations. The amounts weren't huge by the standards of wealthy people, but they were suspiciously well-timed. He'd also made several large purchases: a vacation home in the countryside, a luxury car, expensive artwork, all right after these mysterious payments. When reporters started asking Edmund questions, he initially tried to brush them off. "My financial affairs are private and completely legitimate," he said through a spokesman. "I earned money from consulting work after retiring from active government service, which is entirely normal and proper." But the timeline didn't support that explanation. Some of the payments had come before he officially retired, during the time he was still negotiating on behalf of the British government. That raised obvious questions about conflicts of interest. Then another name emerged: Vincent Torres, an American businessman who'd built a fortune in real estate and hospitality. Vincent wasn't famous like Trump, but he'd been in the former president's orbit for years. They belonged to the same clubs, invested in similar properties, and occasionally appeared together at charity events. Vincent had visited London 17 times during the period when the alleged secret arrangements were being made. That by itself wasn't necessarily suspicious. Lots of businessmen travel frequently. But Vincent had changed his travel patterns during these visits. Instead of staying at the luxury hotels he usually preferred, he'd checked into smaller, less prominent hotels where he was less likely to be recognized. He'd used rental cars instead of his usual hired drivers. He'd made appointments using an assistant's name rather than his own. This behavior suggested someone trying to keep a low profile, which raised the question, why? What was Vincent Torres doing in London that he didn't want people to know about? Cybersecurity experts hired by investigative journalists began tracing digital footprints. They found encrypted communications routed through servers in the Cayman Islands, Switzerland, and Singapore. The encryption was sophisticated, suggesting professional IT support, but the people using it had made small mistakes. They'd logged in from personal devices occasionally, creating links between encrypted accounts and real identities. Through careful analysis of timing and patterns, investigators started mapping out a communication network. British officials talking to American contacts talking to Vincent Torres, Torres communicating with people in Trump's business empire. The network didn't prove anything illegal by itself, but it showed a hidden layer of connections that had never been publicly acknowledged. What confused investigators was that not everyone in this network seemed to be working together. Some messages suggested different people had different agendas. One British official appeared to be trying to benefit British businesses. Another seemed more interested in personal profit. An American businessman wanted favorable treatment for his own company. Vincent Torres was apparently playing multiple sides, making promises to different people that might have contradicted each other. This complexity raised an important question. Was there actually a single secret deal? Or was it more like several overlapping schemes that different people were running independently? Maybe the scandal wasn't one conspiracy, but several smaller ones that happened to occur at the same time and got tangled together. A forensic accountant named Dr. Helen Wang, brought in to analyze financial flows, found shell companies registered in tax havens. These companies had confusing ownership structures designed to hide who actually controlled them. Money flowed between these companies in patterns that made no business sense unless you assumed the point was to disguise the money's real origin and destination. One shell company, registered in the Cayman Islands under a generic name like Global Strategic Consulting Partners, had received money from 3 British companies with government contracts. That same shell company then made payments to American companies connected to Vincent Torres. The timing aligned perfectly with negotiations over specific trade provisions that would benefit those exact British companies. Another web of transactions involved payments, labeled as consulting fees and advisory services, that exceeded what such services typically cost by huge amounts. A company might pay £500,000 for advice that similar firms offered for $50,000. The extra money had to be going somewhere. But figuring out where required tracing transactions through multiple countries and jurisdictions. As more names surfaced, a picture emerged of a casual network of wealthy, connected people who'd known each other for years through business and social circles. They'd done each other favors, made introductions, shared information. Some of this was normal networking, the way business and politics had always worked. But somewhere along the way, that normal networking had crossed a line into something else. A former diplomat who spoke anonymously to journalists described the atmosphere. These people genuinely don't think they're doing anything wrong. In their world, this is just how things work. You help your friends help you, and everyone benefits. They don't see themselves as corrupt because they're not taking briefcases full of cash in dark alleys. They're making legitimate business deals, just using relationships and information that ordinary people don't have access to. That explanation didn't satisfy critics who argued that having one set of rules for the wealthy and connected and another set for everyone else was exactly what corruption looked like, even if nobody involved saw it that way. Personal relationships complicated everything. Edmund's daughter had married the son of an American businessman involved in the network. Vincent Torres's sister had worked for a British company that benefited from the trade arrangements. 2 officials, one British and one American, had been college roommates decades ago and had stayed close friends. Were these personal connections influencing official decisions? Or were people just helping out their friends in ways that happened to overlap with business and politics? Investigators also found participants who seemed to have been used without realizing it. A junior official had set up several meetings between more senior people, thinking he was just doing his job facilitating diplomatic contact. Only later did he realize those meetings weren't going through normal channels and weren't being properly documented. When questioned, he seemed genuinely confused about whether he'd done anything wrong. The scandal also revealed the role of middlemen, people whose jobs seemed to be creating connections and opportunities. These individuals didn't hold government positions or run major companies, but they knew everyone, attended all the right parties, and made introductions that led to profitable arrangements. They operated in a gray zone where networking became influence peddling. But proving where that line was crossed proved nearly impossible. As the list of involved parties grew longer, the scandal became harder to summarize. It wasn't a simple story of bad guys doing bad things. It was a complicated mess of overlapping interests, personal relationships, business deals, policy decisions, and human motivations that ranged from greed to idealism to simple carelessness. Some people had clearly crossed ethical lines and possibly legal ones. Others had just been naive or careless. Some had benefited financially, while others seemed to have gained nothing except professional advancement. The complexity made it hard to assign blame, which frustrated people who wanted clear answers about who did what and why. Dame Patricia Holbrook, reviewing all the new information, felt overwhelmed. What had seemed like a clear case of wrongdoing when James Peterson first presented his evidence now looked like a tangled knot that might be impossible to fully untangle. How far should the investigation go? How many people should face consequences? And how could they draw fair lines between serious misconduct and simple poor judgment? The hidden players kept emerging, each new name adding another thread to an already complicated tapestry. And with each new revelation, the day Captain James Peterson was scheduled to testify publicly before Parliament, television networks cleared their schedules. This wasn't just another political hearing. This was the moment when the man at the center of the biggest scandal in years would tell his story directly to the public, under oath, facing questions from MPs who ranged from supportive to hostile. James barely slept the night before. He lay awake in the safe house where security had moved him and his family, going over his testimony in his mind, worrying about what questions might trip him up. His wife Anna held his hand in the darkness, not saying much because what was there to say? They both knew tomorrow would change their lives forever, one way or another. When morning came, James put on his Royal Guard dress uniform for what might be the last time. The dark blue fabric with its gleaming buttons and medals represented 15 years of service, of standing at attention during long ceremonies, of protecting people he'd never met, of pride in doing a job well. He looked at himself in the mirror and barely recognized the tired, anxious man staring back. The hearing room in Westminster was packed. Every seat filled, people standing along the walls, cameras positioned to capture every angle. Security was intense, with officers checking everyone who entered. Outside the building, crowds had gathered, some supporting James, others calling him a traitor. Police barriers kept them separated to prevent violence. James walked in, escorted by security, and the room fell silent. All those eyes on him, all those cameras. He took his seat at the witness table, a microphone positioned in front of him, a glass of water within reach that he knew he'd need because his mouth had gone completely dry. Dame Patricia Holbrook, leading the questioning, looked at him with an expression that was hard to read. Sympathy, skepticism, professional neutrality, maybe all three. "Captain Peterson," she began, her voice formal for the cameras. "You understand that you are here to give testimony under oath about matters of national importance, that you are required to tell the truth, the whole truth, and that providing false testimony carries serious legal consequences?" "Yes, ma'am, I understand," James replied, his voice steadier than he felt. "Then please, in your own words, tell this committee and the British public what you witnessed and why you felt compelled to come forward." James took a breath and began. He described his role in the Royal Guard, his duties at the diplomatic reception 6 months ago, what he'd seen and overheard. He talked about following the group of men to the private room, about the conversation that had made his blood run cold. They were discussing arrangements that contradicted everything being said publicly, James explained. "I heard specific mentions of financial benefits, of trade provisions that would favor certain companies, of keeping everything off the official record. One person said, 'This stays between us.' No paper trail, no official channels." He described his attempts to report through proper channels, the indifference he'd encountered, the way his concerns had been dismissed, his growing realization that nobody in the system wanted to hear what he had to say. "I didn't want to be a whistleblower," James said, and his voice cracked slightly with emotion. "I just wanted someone to listen, to investigate, to tell me I'd misunderstood. But nobody would. So I had to make a choice between staying quiet and doing what I thought was right." The committee members took turns questioning him. Some were gentle, asking for clarifications and additional details. Others were sharp, looking for inconsistencies or hidden motives. A government MP suggested James had financial problems and had come forward hoping for a book deal or media payments. "I've never accepted money for my story," James responded firmly. "I'm not looking to profit from this. I came forward because I took an oath to serve with honor, and staying silent felt like breaking that oath." Another MP brought up a minor disciplinary incident from 8 years ago when James had been late to a post due to a family emergency. "Should we really trust the word of someone with blemishes on their service record?" the MP asked, a sneer in his voice. James felt anger flash through him but kept his composure. "That incident involved me choosing to take my sick daughter to the hospital, rather than arriving exactly on time to stand watch at an event. I received a written warning, which I accepted. If caring about my family more than perfect punctuality makes me unreliable, then yes, I'm unreliable. But I've never lied, never stolen, never betrayed my duty." The exchange was heated, but it seemed to help James more than hurt him. Watching at home, many people saw a politician trying to smear a decent man over nothing, and it made them trust James more, not less. The questioning continued for hours. James was asked to describe specific conversations in minute detail. He was challenged on why he hadn't recorded everything on video. He was asked whether he'd had political motivations or personal grudges against any of the people he'd implicated. To every question, James gave clear, consistent answers. He admitted when he wasn't sure about something rather than making guesses. He acknowledged that some of his evidence was circumstantial, that he couldn't prove everyone's intentions, that intelligent people might interpret the same facts differently, that honesty seemed to resonate. People expecting a crusader with absolute certainty found instead a regular person who'd stumbled onto something wrong and tried to do the right thing despite all his doubts and fears. The defense lawyers, hired by some of the implicated officials, got their turn to cross-examine. They were aggressive, trying to shake James's story, to find contradictions between what he said now and what was in his original written statement. One lawyer spent 20 minutes asking about the exact positioning of people in a room during one conversation, suggesting James couldn't have heard what he claimed to hear from where he said he was standing. James pulled out a hand-drawn diagram he'd made right after the event, showing the room layout and where everyone had been. "I drew this the same night," he explained. "I knew I might need to prove details later, so I documented everything while it was fresh in my memory." The lawyer looked frustrated, having expected to catch him in an inconsistency, and moved on to other attack angles. Another lawyer questioned James's expertise, arguing that he was a security guard, not a diplomat or trade expert, so how could he possibly understand the nuances of what he'd overheard? "I don't claim to understand all the technical details of trade policy," James admitted. "But I know the difference between official business conducted properly and secret meetings where people explicitly say to keep things off the record. I know what hiding looks like." Expert witnesses followed James's testimony. Financial analysts presented their findings about suspicious transactions. Former diplomatic staff explained proper protocols and how the alleged arrangements violated them. Cybersecurity experts verified that the encrypted communications James had discovered were genuine and had passed through servers designed to hide their origin. But there were also experts who cast doubt on the whole narrative. A trade policy specialist argued that everything documented could be explained as legitimate, if unconventional, diplomatic outreach. A lawyer specializing in government ethics suggested that while some behavior might have been inappropriate, none of it necessarily rose to the level of criminal activity. The hearing lasted 4 full days. James returned each morning in his uniform, answered every question put to him, and maintained his composure even when being accused of lying, betraying his country or seeking personal glory. On the final day, Dame Patricia asked James one last question. "Captain Peterson, looking back now, knowing the impact your decision has had on your life, your family, the government, and international relations, do you regret coming forward?" James was quiet for a moment, thinking about his kids who couldn't go to school normally anymore, about his wife who'd lost privacy and peace, about the career he'd probably lost, about the friends who'd stopped talking to him. "I regret that it had to happen this way," he finally said. "I regret that doing the right thing has been so costly, but I don't regret speaking up. If I'd stayed silent, I'd have lost something more important than my job or my comfortable life. I'd have lost my ability to look at myself in the mirror and respect what I see." That might sound dramatic, but it's true. Some things matter more than being safe and comfortable. When the hearing finally ended, James was exhausted, emotionally drained, but also felt a strange sense of relief. He'd told his truth. Whether people believed him or not was out of his hands now. Outside the hearing room, public opinion was sharply divided. Social media exploded with arguments. Some people praised James as a hero who'd stood up to powerful people at great personal cost. Others called him a naive fool who'd damaged Britain's international standing over things he didn't fully understand. Still others suggested he was part of a larger political conspiracy, though they couldn't agree on which side was supposedly using him. News analysts dissected every moment of his testimony. Body language experts claimed his gestures proved he was telling the truth. Other body language experts said the exact same gestures proved he was lying. Everyone saw what they wanted to see. Confirmation of beliefs they'd already held before he ever opened his mouth. 6 months after James Peterson first walked into that secure room at Westminster with his leather folder of evidence, the final investigative report was released. It landed on a Thursday morning, all 400 pages of it, dense with legal language, footnotes, and carefully worded conclusions that had been negotiated between investigators, lawyers, and political advisors. The report's release was managed like a military operation. Copies were distributed to parliamentary leaders an hour before public release, giving them time to prepare their responses. News organizations received embargoed copies with strict instructions not to publish until the official time. Everyone knew this moment would define how the scandal was remembered and what consequences, if any, would follow. Dame Patricia Holbrook held a press conference to present the findings. She looked tired, aged by the investigation process, but spoke clearly and firmly. This investigation has examined extensive evidence regarding diplomatic and trade arrangements between British and American officials and associated business interests, she began, reading from a prepared statement. We have concluded that irregular communications did occur outside standard diplomatic channels. Proper documentation and oversight procedures were not consistently followed. Some officials failed to fully disclose contacts and arrangements that should have been reported. She paused, looking up from her notes. However, we have not found sufficient evidence to conclude that criminal activity occurred under current law. What we found was a failure of judgment, a disregard for transparency norms, and a casual attitude toward proper procedures rather than a deliberate criminal conspiracy. That conclusion satisfied absolutely nobody. People who wanted dramatic prosecutions felt betrayed. Those who defended the officials saw it as vindication that no crimes were proven. James Peterson, watching from his living room, felt a complicated mix of validation and frustration. He'd been right that something wrong had happened, but wrong if he'd hoped for clear accountability. The report did name names. 3 mid-level officials were specifically cited for failing to follow proper procedures and for misleading Parliament during inquiries. Within hours of the report's release, all 3 announced their resignations. Their statements were nearly identical, acknowledging errors in judgment, while maintaining they'd acted in good faith at all times. Sir Edmund Hartley faced civil penalties for financial impropriety. He was ordered to pay back over £200,000 in what the report termed inappropriately received consulting fees. He avoided criminal charges but lost his knighthood, a symbolic punishment that actually seemed to hurt him more than the financial penalty. The man who'd spent his life building prestige and reputation saw it all crumble. Edmund gave one brief interview after the penalties were announced, looking older and diminished. I made mistakes, he admitted. I allowed personal relationships to cloud my professional judgment. I'm sorry for the embarrassment I've caused, but I want to be clear that I never intentionally betrayed my country or acted with criminal intent. Vincent Torres, the American businessman at the center of many connections, faced no official consequences because he'd operated entirely in the United States and hadn't technically violated any American laws. The FBI looked into his activities but ultimately declined to pursue charges. Vincent issued a statement through his lawyer denying any wrongdoing and threatening to sue anyone who defamed his character. Then he disappeared from public view, probably hoping the whole thing would blow over. As for Trump himself, the report's language was diplomatic to the point of uselessness. It noted that some communications involved or referenced individuals associated with the former administration, but stopped short of making specific accusations. Trump immediately declared total victory, holding another press conference where he claimed the report proved he'd been right all along about being persecuted by fake news. Complete exoneration, he announced, although the report had said no such thing. I told you it was all lies, and now even their own investigation admits it. No crimes, no corruption, just great deal-making that made jealous people mad. Legal experts pointed out that not finding enough evidence to prosecute wasn't the same as proving innocence. But those nuances got lost in the political noise. Trump's supporters believed him completely. His critics remained convinced of wrongdoing regardless of what reports said. The truth, whatever it was, seemed less important than what various sides wanted to believe. The British government responded to the report by announcing new transparency measures for diplomatic negotiations. All meetings above a certain level would require detailed documentation. Officials would face mandatory ethics training. A new oversight committee would review diplomatic arrangements regularly. Critics argued these measures had too many loopholes and exceptions for national security concerns, meaning determined officials could still find ways around them. Prime Minister Jonathan Sheffield survived the scandal, though his popularity took a permanent hit. He reshuffled his cabinet, moving some ministers to different positions and bringing in new faces to create an impression of change. In a national address, he acknowledged that mistakes were made and promised to restore trust in government. But polls showed that trust, once broken, wasn't easily repaired. Confidence in government remained at historic lows. People felt cynical about politicians promising reform after being caught doing wrong. The whole episode reinforced a growing belief that powerful people played by different rules and rarely faced real consequences for their actions. For James Peterson, the aftermath was bittersweet. He'd been vindicated in his core claim that something improper had happened, but the lack of criminal charges made some people question whether coming forward had been worth it. The Royal Guard, unsure what to do with him, offered a transfer to an administrative position that was technically a promotion, but felt like being put out to pasture. James declined the transfer and resigned from the Guard instead. It was time for a new chapter. He'd done what he set out to do, told the truth as he understood it, and now he needed to move on. Finding new work proved challenging. Some employers saw him as a hero, but others worried he'd be a liability, someone who might expose their secrets too. Eventually, he found a position with a non-profit organization focused on government accountability and transparency. The pay was less than he'd made as a captain, but the work felt meaningful. He gave occasional speeches about ethics and whistleblowing, always emphasizing that he was just a regular person who'd tried to do the right thing, not some kind of moral authority. His family slowly adjusted to their new normal. The death threats decreased but never completely stopped. His kids went back to regular school, though they'd learned some hard lessons about how complicated adult morality could be. His wife Anna went back to teaching but found she had less patience than before for petty complaints about minor problems. When you've lived through genuine crisis, small stuff doesn't seem as important. The media eventually moved on to new scandals and crises. The story that had dominated headlines for months became a footnote, referenced occasionally when similar situations arose but no longer commanding daily attention. Historians and political scientists would write papers analyzing what happened and what it meant. But for ordinary people, life moved forward. Some good did come from the scandal. The transparency measures, flawed as they were, did make it slightly harder to conduct secret arrangements. More junior officials felt empowered to report concerns, knowing that whistleblowers could sometimes be taken seriously. Public awareness of corruption and accountability issues increased, even if cynicism did too. But arguably the biggest impact was on public trust. Surveys showed that confidence in government remained low years after the scandal. People approached official statements with more skepticism. Conspiracy theories found more fertile ground because if secret deals could happen once, who knew what else might be hidden? That loss of trust had consequences that rippled through society in subtle but important ways. 2 years after his initial revelation, James was invited to speak at a university about ethics and public service. A student asked him whether he'd do it all again, knowing everything it cost him. James thought for a long moment before answering. You know, people expect me to say yes immediately, that I'd absolutely do it again because it was so righteous and important. But honestly, I don't know. I lost a career I loved. My family went through hell. The consequences were massive and messy and didn't solve everything. If I'd known all that beforehand, would I still have done it? I want to say yes, but I'm not completely sure. He paused, looking at the young faces watching him. But here's what I do know. In that moment when I had to choose, I made the choice I could live with. Maybe that's all any of us can do. Not make perfect choices with perfect foresight, but make choices we can live with based on what we know and what we value. Sometimes that's enough. The scandal itself faded into history, remembered differently by different people. Some saw it as proof that systems sometimes worked, that whistleblowers could expose wrongdoing and create some accountability. Others saw it as proof that powerful people rarely faced real consequences,